Please welcome our workshop rapporteurs, Research Associate, Organic Agriculture Policy at University of California, Santa Cruz, Mark Lipson. Executive Director of Rural Advancement Foundation International, USA, Scott Marlow. Policy Director at Land for Good, Cris Coffin. And panel moderator, Director of Marketing Services, USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, Keck.
Good morning, everybody. This is your Rapporteur compliment. Reporting back from the workshops yesterday, there are 4 themes that we identified, and this isn't actually going to be in rap style. We're sort of a different generation, so it's going to be more like free verse and a little bit of interpretive dance. But there are 4 big buckets that we identified that cut across all the workshops. So I want to telegraph those to you, and then we'll be having a conversation just about highlights and things that we noticed and extracted from each of our workshop series. So the first one is the emergence into this age of data and measurement for the whole field of local food systems, local and regional foods, and all the different aspects that we've been talking about, but coming from the age of anecdote into the realm of actual measurement and data. So many different aspects of that. The second then is what about the picture that we're actually getting? What are the data points? What are the key findings that we flagged in our discussions yesterday? The third area is what do we do with it? What are the implications for applying this information that we're starting to get? And then finally, to send you off into the final workshop of each of our tracks, what are the frontiers? What are the things that we can imagine we'll be talking about 5 years from now in terms of measuring things that we haven't even thought about yet? So off to you guys.
And as we get started, we really wanted to thank the moderators that we worked with, Carlos Coleman, Jill Fitzsimmons, David Glasgow, and especially the note takers, without whom we wouldn't have been able to do this, the folks who actually wrote things down when we were trying to listen. Shannon Hill, Stephanie Westell, and Laura Popilski.
Thank you.
And they're all available for job offers. So, the realm of data and measurement, the emergence of this field. I mean, we heard a lot of things just about the importance of now having this self-knowledge about local and regional food systems that we didn't necessarily have before.
Right. I think one of the things that came out of one of our workshops is that we have become much clearer in both what and how to measure. And I'm thinking particularly of the new HUD logic model and tracking template, where they have also zoned in on 8 core metrics while also recognizing the importance of communities to be able to track their local impacts. And so this sort of sense that they are becoming more specific in what they measure, but also recognizing that they need to work together with community impacts.
And one of the things that we saw was this sort of line between the qualitative and quantitative, that as quantitative has become more available and more and has become more prominent and more doable, that the qualitative and the stories still need to be told. Because one of the things that came out of one of our sessions was, in telling the story of one of the farms, new things to measure and new ways to get at the benefits come out of those stories, and that importance of continuing to have both quantitative and qualitative to keep track of the rapidly emerging new benefits, new things, new ways of thinking about what could be evaluated.
But, and I would just piggyback on that as part of that there's also a recognition that we need to always understand the audience for the data. And so that gets back to that storytelling, because what good is that metric if it's not allowing a particular stakeholder to be able to tell the story to their various audiences as well?
Yeah, I think it was hugely rich to see the interaction among all the different practitioners who have been going through these projects and exercises, starting to share best practices, maybe would be a good rubric for it, for how to do measurement and evaluation, particularly in this sphere of local and regional food systems. And there are so many different aspects of that, both in terms of how to select meaningful indicators. We had a great discussion about that, and all the different things that you need to have as background to inform knowing what to measure and what's meaningful to measure. And also about the participatory and democratizing aspect of doing this at all, and both the obstacles to participation, dealing with different kinds of communities, how to make it worth it to the people you're asking for information, to have them share it with you, and then what happens to it afterwards.
And part of that, something that really resonated in one of our sessions, was the whole issue of trust and transparency. And you've heard in a lot of our conversations about a values-based value chain that the transparency and trust is a huge part of the value of it. And so part of what really resonated was that lots of people that folks were working with had been burned, where they had either shared information or had shared what they were doing and then had been burned by it. And so really moving beyond the issue of just interpersonal trust, like I trust you, but then you may be in a company that doesn't, isn't valued there, but then moving past that into really being clear about what are our ways that we're going to work together? What are the, what are the criteria by which we're going to work, and how are we going to agree to build that trust and to be able to maintain that trust and transparency?
So what I'd like to hear is, did any of the workshops shed light or have an aha moment to a point that Congresswoman Shelley Pingree made this morning, which is, as the other commodity groups come around to Congress, especially in anticipation of a farm bill, and talk about their stories in their industries, that is the mainline commodities, to what extent does local food have a story or is integrated with the commodity story? Did any of the workshops or the combined learnings from the workshops shed any light on that point raised by the Congresswoman?
Well, I would point to one sort of aha moment, which was Andrew with Federal Reserve Board. And with the upcoming book that they have been working with USDA and others on, and that him saying specifically that the Fed recognized local and regional food systems as an important risk management tool for farmers. So that makes us think that, okay, so if that local and regional foods, that we should be thinking of them as a complement and as important as other commodity and crop insurance programs, that yet again, it's another risk management tool. So that the story that we tell is that this is of value to producers across the board.
One of the things that we heard in our session was that there is actually data out there that people didn't know. Folks are so used to working in the realm of the anecdote that there is actually an emerging body of data that people weren't aware of. And one of the aha moments that came out for us was some Census of Agriculture analysis that Becca Jablonski from Colorado had done, which basically said that at all scales, the survivability index was greater for farms who had some level of participation in local markets over those who did not. And so that's 27 to 2012, which is a time of record high commodity prices. But even in that situation, at all scales, folks who had some level of participation in local foods markets had a higher level of survivability than those who didn't.
So there were a number of areas moving into that second bucket of the picture that we're getting. I think that were counterintuitive, maybe sort of threatening some sacred cows that people might have had, assumptions about local and regional food systems and how they function and what their impacts are. And this is the important reason that we're doing all this, is to validate or not our assumptions and what we are thinking we're actually doing. You know, what are our theories of change? Did some of those show up for you guys?
And there was some of the data that came out that was about different local markets and what is the net return on investment from different local markets is beginning to come out of the aggregated data, where some of the markets weren't as that first of all, there was a really wide variability in some markets between the best and the worst, where it was a much wider variability than in others. But also that some that folks assumed were very had a high return, didn't have as high a return. And so being able to sort of break down some of those economic numbers to help give guidance to folks about where to be looking at how to market.
I would say sort of as the economic impacts are becoming clearer, as you guys were talking about, that the sort of broader picture is still murky, as we were talking about earlier. And so in our sessions, the recognition that being able to look at community well-being and social impacts, that we still have a long ways to go on that, and connecting the dots. So Mike Norton, for instance, talked about that, yes, that we can now measure access to fresh food, but we haven't connected that dot to really what are the ultimate health outcomes from that. So that there's still a lot of connecting the dots that need to be done, and a lot of work on those social impacts.
There's so many different dimensions that were part of the conversations yesterday. One of the most interesting ones I thought was Rich Pirog's presentation on the Food Hub's national survey assessment and the series of data that they've gotten now they're in their third iteration, and finding out that not all food hubs are dependent on foundation money. Some of them are actually making a profit, more income than net expenses. So, you know, really beginning to get a handle on the actual dimensions of success and performance of all these different parts of the system.
But there's also in our session, and I believe it was John Fisk maybe who raised it, of talking about the inherent tensions as well, and looking at, you know, business outcomes and social impact outcomes are not necessarily, you know, that there's a tension there, as are potentially healthy, affordable food access and fair prices to farmers. So that sort of thinking about those as we're talking about measurements is important.
And
That same thing that same issue of what are we measuring and how do we look at that? One of the conversations we had was, well, you know, people ask me how many folks I hire. They don't ask me how much I pay them. And so some of those issues and what we've talked about out of organic is, if you can't measure it and you can't document it, you can't protect it. And so being able to begin to put, and this was one of the things that we had, was the need for further dialogue about the metrics, what's easy to collect, what's not, and how we can continue to evolve those metrics to get closer to what are we trying to do here? What does success look like?
So Scott, that's a dialogue between funders and the grantees, dialogue, how many ways does that dialogue go?
In terms of the businesses, we've talked about this issue of trust and transparency, and the presentation we had earlier from the Common Market was, obviously it's all about trust and transparency and how that chain works together. What I heard people saying was, we need that same level of trust and transparency in the evaluation community between the academics, the people from government, the practitioners, and the business people. And that same level of trust and transparency where we're able to talk to each other about what's doable, what do we need to know, what are we finding out. There was a lot about the information separation that some communities had access to data that others really could use. If you know that and you're accessing that, that data, I'd love to be able to use that as the basis for my evaluation instead of having to start from scratch with a 10-page survey. If I really knew what you knew, then I could just have a 1-page survey or a 2, and just focus on finding out what I need to figure out so that my community sees where it fits into those broader pictures. But that the trust and transparency is something that kept coming up however you want to slice it.
And yeah, the trust is the whole basis, in a way, of the local foods economies and relationships, and how to measure those non-economic variables was a very kind of edgy part of our discussion. I don't think anybody's got the absolute answer to that by any means, but there's definitely a quest for going further with that. And that connected to the whole conversation about platforms and technological innovation in collecting information and ways that we can expand the type of knowledge and information that we're gleaning. And that extended then to not just talking about technological innovation, but sort of professional innovation and social science innovation with respect to trying to understand the communities and relationships that are involved here. So what about the rural-urban picture, or the connections between rural and urban that emerged in your workshops?
Well, we sort of danced around it. I think there was a sensitivity that there are challenges. There's challenges in working across that urban-rural divide that, and I think Kate just touched on this in this last session, was talking about just the supply chain differences and how you evaluate those. But in our session, Pamela with the Central Alabama Regional Economic and Planning Commissioner, I apologize, Pamela, that she talked that, again, just in the rural communities, differences amongst rural communities, so that she had this example of in a couple, at least in one county in Alabama, finding producers who are growing vegetables is a really tough challenge. And that's very different from the next county over. And so just sort of thinking about those, that it's not just differences urban-rural, but rural-rural.
And the other piece that came out in our conversation was that we frequently look at either end of that connection. Mm-hmm. So you're either looking at what's happening on the farm or what's happening in the community, but there's not a lot of evaluation and tracking that's going on of the different pieces between it. So who's tracking the grocery stores of the middle, or the pieces of that chain that are critically important, but are also facing a lot of the same squeeze and a lot of the same issues, and where those things are where that's being stopped.
Steve Vogel from the Economic Research Service, in discussing the big national surveys that USDA is doing now, and has the beginnings of a longitudinal series so that this can be tracked over time. Just threw out this fascinating line to me. He said that the information there about the structure of intermediate short chain marketing is showing to him, call it prima facie evidence of rural-urban connection. I think that's right. I hope I captured it accurately, but it really stuck in my mind because when we were doing the whole Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food initiative inside USDA, this was a big question. How do we actually not just sort of create separate local food systems that are in rural areas and urban areas, but how do we connect those? And so there's a lot to be mined in the data. I think that was the real bottom line, is that there's a lot of richness in the data that can trace the connections, both in terms of product and economics, between rural and urban areas in delving into this whole measurement of the local foods economy.
Right.
So I'd like to hear, out of the three panels, was there any discussion or findings around training, technical assistance, how to measure impacts of those efforts throughout the local and regional systems?
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, especially in the session on community level measurement, the National Farm to School Network, their evaluation framework, I think definitely, included a component of that, how to evaluate the ability to assist school districts with farm to school purchasing and delivery.
And we had a whole conversation actually in both sessions of ours that was about the difficulty of capturing, okay, so if someone trains someone on something or makes a connection or something like that, how do you and then they go on to something, how does that get captured? One of the stories that was really compelling was about the food hub that was part of the presentation, where they had farmers come in and then drop out, which in the initial evaluation was negative. But the truth is that they had dropped out because the work through the food hub had gotten them to a point where they were doing their own marketing and connecting to businesses or consumers. So it was a stepping stone. So that wasn't that they were falling out. It was that they were moving on and using it as a stepping stone, and how difficult it was to track. Okay, it's not just who's in and who's out, but it's what happens after. Where do they move on to when they leave? Are they moving on to better things? And you have that same thing you heard earlier in the job training and some of the other issues for any kind of training, how to track those pieces going forward.
And our conversations were slightly broader because it was more about measuring the impact of connections and connections across the food system. I mean, both sort of smaller and writ large, and some discussion about sort of the emerging work around social network analysis, and that being something that we need to be able to both measure and tell that story in a better way, or in a stronger way.
So that's getting us into this whole question of how do we use this information? What are the applications of all the measurement and data collection that we're doing? We just barely touched on the policy realm, and that was certainly a big underlying thread in all the conversations we were having in Track A yesterday. It's like, okay, how do we take this information to policymakers and program designers within the agencies? And I think we're in a whole new era now of being able to bring hard data to that, and I think that's going to make a big difference.
We also talked a good bit about bringing that data back to the folks from whom it was gathered. And so for both the farmers and being able to say to a farmer, look, by participating in this survey, or a person in the urban area, by participating in this is the benefit that you're going to get, and not just being yet another survey and survey fatigue. But also that data comes back to practitioners or the NGOs who are on the ground, the different folks who are in the field, in a way that's digestible, in a way that's not an academic paper or a report or something like that, but that is boiled down to where they can use it as a tool and can bring it back in. And this goes back to one of the big themes that came out of our whole track was the importance of the conversation. The importance of the conversation. We had a whole session about the new specialty crop block grant metrics and how that is, the evaluation of that is just emerging. We're just starting to get experience with that. We had people bring up, I've hired academics to do evaluation for us, and I told them exactly what we needed, and they went away and came back with what they needed and what they wanted, and not what I needed. And a lot of those kinds of trust and transparency and making it available. and that goes back to your democratization thing.
One of the things that we talked about was that how better metrics have led to sort of new investment tools and willingness amongst lenders to invest in the local food economy. And Andrew, with the Federal Reserve Board, I thought had a very interesting quote when he said that everybody has different risk appetites. And much of the data has been helping sort of sift through that in terms of willingness and the types of financial tools that lenders are making available.
Yeah, the lack of hard data has been an absolute obstacle in many realms of policy development for, you know, organic and local and regional food systems, in terms of, you know, needing actuarial data for crop insurance, or, you know, real reliable market numbers in order for lenders to support somebody who's primarily engaged in direct marketing. And that's really going to have an important infiltration impact in the agencies. But you know, it's a double-edged sword too. You know, sometimes the data doesn't necessarily support the argument that you are already predisposed to make to policymakers and agency managers. So, you know, we have to both live and be willing to die by the data to some degree.
Right.
Even before we get to sort of actuarial and being, and that's critically important, we've seen that over time, folks have spoken to that. There is a, within lending, there is a comfort level that comes with, oh, there is information about this out there. There's a comfort level with what comes next and how that, and or all of these, all of the alternative type, you know, these new things, lending to things that might have been a little wacky a few years ago.
Okay, I know there's still time on the clock, but I'm just anxious about getting everything in today. And you guys are great. You're doing deep thinking. And the most important thing we need to know is that it carries on in the next workshop, and that these guys, along with the note takers and the facilitators, are really doing a deep mind meld, Vulcan mind meld. I don't know what it is, Ken, but just know that everyone in that work that you're doing in the workshops is being captured, and we're really working as a team to think it through. We are all having dinner, early dinner tonight together to sort of think more about it. So I want to thank my rapporteurs, and then I want to give you some instructions for the rest of the day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.